In a lot of ways, this is the most interesting chapter in the book, and it's the last one. I think it's the most interesting chapter of the book about communication and spatial cognition. So, communication is basic to the human experience, and maybe that's one of the reasons why I find it so fascinating. So, we're going to talk about lots of different forms of aphasia, which is difficulty speaking. And we're going to describe the locations and functions of some language-oriented areas in the brain, Wernicke's area and Broca's area. We're going to describe Wernicke's and Broca's aphasias, and we're going to compare and contrast dysarthria, Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, conductive aphasia, and global aphasia. And we're going to define and describe the clinical implications of unilateral neglect and I can't say that word. We're going to describe it and what it is. And maybe I'll be able to say it by the end of the lecture. Some days you can say stuff and some days you can't. And today's one of those days that I can't say it. So communication, super interesting function of the human brain and essential to the human experience. The temporoparietal association area is specialized for understanding communication, directing attention, and comprehending space. Isn't that interesting? In approximately 95% of adults, cortical areas responsible for understanding language and producing speech are found in the left hemisphere, and the areas for comprehending space are found in the right hemisphere. 5% of people, it's opposite. Who knows why? And the distinction between language and speech is clinically important. So we'll talk about it. The left hemisphere typically specializes in understanding and producing language, including speech and writing. The right hemisphere specializes in understanding space, organizing movements relative to spatial orientation, navigating and understanding and producing nonverbal communication. So when we talked about emotion, we talked about how you interpret nonverbal communication to extrapolate other people's emotion, which is important. Like we could look at someone and perceive their nonverbal communication. You could say that person looks angry or that person looks happy based on their nonverbal communication. So our right hemisphere is probably taking a look at that, and our amygdala and area 25 and all those nifty areas in the thalamus that deal with emotion. But the left hemisphere is usually the language guy. So if we have a stroke that affects the left hemisphere, we are maybe going to have language disorders. So language comprehension occurs in Wernicke's area, and that includes understanding spoken, written, and signed language. So sign language is a form of language, and it is processed in the same areas as verbal language. And written language is a form of language, and it's processed in the same areas as verbal language. So all of our language skills are processed in the same areas of the brain. So symbols are words or signs that represent an object or concept. And Wernicke's interprets symbols. Broca's area provides instructions, motor instructions for language output. And it provides the grammatical relationship between words when writing, and Wernicke's area provides formulation of language. So they work together. And we'll look at a little flow chart of how they work together, which is super interesting. So in English, as in other languages, we have word order and things that make sense to us. So I read this recently, and I think this is super interesting. But native English speakers, we know this just from learning English as our first language, even though we don't know we know it. But we know that there is an absolute order for adjectives in order for things to make sense. So the order is opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose, and then the noun. So the example that is given in this is you can have a lovely little old rectangular green French silver whittling knife, but if you mess with that word order in the slightest, you sound strange. It doesn't sound right. The strange thing is that every native English speaker uses that list, but almost none of us could write it out. None of us even know about it until someone tells us that size comes before color and that sort of thing. So that information is stored in Broca's area, the grammatical relationship between words when writing. And Wernicke's area contributes to with the meaning of the words. So super, super interesting. So if you were to compare this to the sensory and motor areas, Wernicke's area is like the one of the auditory association area for language, and Broca's area is the motor planning area for language. So it just gets better and better. Okay, here we go. Here's the flow chart. So sound comes in the primary auditory cortex, just like every sound. Language comes in as a sound. And the primary auditory cortex says it's a sound and it's this loud and it's coming from over there. And the secondary auditory cortex classifies the sound. So it says it's a noise, it's music, it's language. Haha. And if the secondary auditory cortex recognizes it as language, it sends it to Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area comprehends that language with vocabulary. That's where our vocabulary is stored. So the really cool thing is when you learn a new language, you get more neurons built up in Wernicke's area. Isn't that neat? So then Wernicke's area compares it to the vocabulary that you know. It sends the information through subcortical connection, so that subcortical white matter, to Broca's area. Broca's area formulates the instructions for language output. And then the oral and throat region of the sensory motor cortex gives us the cortical output to the speech muscles. So all these different areas contribute to language. The understanding, the comprehension, the the sensory part of it, the comprehension, the motor instructions for language output, and the actual cortical output for the speech muscles. So you could have a disorder in any one of those areas and it could affect speech. Interesting, right? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about language disorders. So in general, aphasia is a language disorder affecting spoken language. So common types of aphasia include Wernicke's, Broca's, conduction aphasia, which involves the white matter connection between Wernicke's and Broca's, and global aphasia, which affects everything. Alexia is a language disorder affecting the comprehension of written language. And agraphia is a language disorder affecting the ability to write. So it's not your physical ability to write with your hand, it's the instructions that come from the brain that tell you how to write. Okay, so those are some language disorders. Wernicke's aphasia, language comprehension is impaired. Remember, Wernicke's is comprehending it and sorting out the vocabulary and figuring out what it means. People with Wernicke's can easily produce spoken sounds, but the output is meaningless because we can't comprehend what's going on. So their Broca's area is still working. They can speak pretty easily. Sometimes it's called fluent aphasia because you can speak fluently, but you're not really saying anything. People with Wernicke's aphasia also have alexia, which is the inability to write meaningful words, and paraphasia, which is the unintended use of words or phrases. There is a video in the Canvas module that shows a therapist working with someone with Wernicke's aphasia, and it's super interesting. It's real short if you get a chance to watch it. The inability to produce and understand language may be analogous to when a person with an intact native language encounters an unknown foreign language. So if somebody is speaking, let's see, what language don't I know? Lots of them. Someone is speaking a language to me that I don't know. My Wernicke's area doesn't have any meaning to associate with those words. So I'm like, and I don't have words to produce to respond to that person because I don't know that language. People with Wernicke's aphasia often appear to be unaware of the disorder. So when you watch that video, you'll see that the person that's being interviewed by the therapist does really appear to be unaware of the disorder. So very interesting. Broca's aphasia is, on the other hand, is different. It's difficulty expressing oneself using language. So Wernicke's aphasia, also called fluent aphasia, because you can speak fluently, but you can't really say anything meaningful. Broca's aphasia has that you can't come up with the words a lot of times. So people with Broca's aphasia may not produce any language output, or they may be able to generate habitual phrases. So when you're working with, I've worked with actually a lot of people with Broca's aphasia. I've never worked with anybody with Wernicke's aphasia. And I would imagine it would be more difficult because the person with Broca's aphasia, they can understand what you're saying and they can attribute meaning to your words, but they have trouble producing their own language output. But a lot of times they'll say a habitual phrase, like I worked with one guy and his response was always yes, yes. He could say yes, yes. And sometimes you're working with people with Broca's aphasia who regain the ability to say certain words, or they can say short phrases, but they can't do whole sentences. People with Broca's aphasia are usually aware of their language difficulties and they're frustrated. So they've processed the incoming language, they've decided what they're going to say, but they can't get the words out, and so it's frustrating. So it's called Wernicke's is sometimes called fluent aphasia, sometimes it's called receptive aphasia because you can't receive the information. Broca's aphasia is also sometimes called motor aphasia, expressive aphasia, and non-fluent aphasia. Those are all synonymous with Broca's aphasia. So Wernicke's is receptive and fluent. Broca's is motor, expressive, or non-fluent. Conduction aphasia results from the damage to the neurons that connect Wernicke's and Broca's areas. So in the most severe form, speech and writing of people with conduction aphasia are meaningless. So they can produce some speech and they can maybe write some things, but they don't have any meaning associated with them. Global aphasia is the most severe form of aphasia. It's the inability to use language in any form. So spoken, written, signed, doesn't matter. Can't understand it, can't speak, write, read, any of that stuff. So they can't produce understandable speech. They can't comprehend spoken language. It's usually caused by a large lesion that damages the lateral left cerebrum. So you hit all your areas, your Wernicke's area, your conduction areas, and your Broca's area. So that's the most severe form of aphasia. So nonverbal communication is gestures, facial expressions, tone of voice, and posture that convey meanings in addition to a verbal message. So the right hemisphere anterior frontal gyrus, which is the right hemisphere area analogous to Broca's and Wernicke's on the left, provides instruction for producing nonverbal communication, including emotional gestures and intonation of speech. So people with that area affected, they will have a very flat affect, no emotional gestures, very flat speech intonation. And I've definitely worked with people with this form of communication disorder, and they're super hard to read. It's really hard to read the room. Can't tell if they're having a great time in therapy or having a terrible time because they don't have that nonverbal communication. But you can still work with them pretty easily because they can understand you and they can speak to you. They just are very flat. They don't have the nonverbal communication, but they do maintain their verbal communication. So lesions of the right temporoparietal junction cause difficulty understanding nonverbal communication. So that's the person, they can't pick up on your nonverbal communication. Damage to the right inferior frontal gyrus can cause a person to speak in a monotone, be unable to effectively communicate nonverbally, and to lack emotional facial expressions and gestures. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting. But it's always fun to work with a variety of people and see these different things. So spatial perception is also controlled in a similar area on the right side of the cerebral cortex. So the right parietal lobe spatial coordinate system is used in constructing an image of your own body and for planning movements. So the right hemisphere parietal association cortex comprehends spatial relationships and provides a body schema and a schema of the body in relation to its surroundings and the external world. So body schema, also known as body image, is a mental representation of how the body is anatomically arranged. So you know where your right hand is, and you know where your left hand is, and you know where your feet are. So you have that. When you have your intact body schema, you have that mental representation of your body. When you're lacking that because of a CVA or any other kind of brain damage, brain disorder, you might not be aware of one side or the other. You might just you don't have a good perception of where your body is, or where you are in space, or where you are in relationship to your surroundings. And pathfinding is a problem if you have disorders of spatial perception. Finding your way around. So neglect is the tendency to behave as if one side of the body or one side of space does not exist. Usually affects the left side of the body and the left side of space. It may be misinterpreted by others as confusion or lack of cooperation, but it's not. And it's not intentional, and it's also the person who has neglect doesn't know that they have neglect. So these pictures are from the book, and so the top one, the doctor drew like this kind of like basic floor plan of a house, sort of, and wanted the patient to reproduce that drawing. And this is how they drew it. Interesting, right? And then the bottom picture, the therapist wanted them to draw a clock with the numbers 1 through 12 on them, and put the hands at a certain time. And they drew all the numbers on the right side of the clock and nothing on the left side of the clock. So very interesting. So neglect is a really super interesting area. I worked with one lady who had a right-sided CVA, and she had left-sided neglect. So it tends to affect the left side because your body schema is on the right side of your cerebral hemisphere. And so if you have a CVA on the right side, you're going to get those language problems. If you have a CVA on the right side, you're going to have spatial and nonverbal communication problems. Okay, so that's why it's usually on the left side and the left side of space. But I worked with one lady who actually her balance was pretty good and her mobility was really good after her stroke. But she had that left side, she had a left visual field cut and left neglect, and she couldn't attend to the left side of anything. So it was very interesting. And I've worked with lots of people who have left side neglect, and it's like that the left side of their body doesn't even exist. So it's really easy for them to just accidentally have their left hand trailing down and kind of get caught up in the spokes of the wheelchair or something like that, and they don't even notice. So you have to notice for them. So they can rebuild that awareness, but it is a very interesting phenomenon. Personal neglect is a little bit different. So aspects of personal neglect include unilateral lack of awareness of sensory stimuli. So that's a little bit about that, like hand being caught in the spokes of the wheelchair and not noticing. Unilateral lack of personal hygiene and grooming. So it's like the person might comb one side of their hair and not the other. And unilateral lack of the movement of limbs. So one side has motion, the other side doesn't. It results from a failure to direct attention. It's also called hemi-inattention. So, gosh, I can't, I'm not, I'm having some neglect problems with that particular word, but that word is a form of denial that occurs in some people with severe hemiparesis and personal neglect. So the lesion is often in the right anterior insula, which is in the thalamus, and it's an area devoted to the representation of self and distinguishing between self and others. So you just you don't perceive that one side, the hemiplegic side, is your hand. So you might see that hand, might see that left hand, but it doesn't look like your hand. It looks like somebody else's hand. Very interesting. I'll work on the pronunciation of that word. Sorry. So spatial neglect is characterized by a lack of understanding of spatial relationships, and it results in a deranged internal representation of space. So manifestations of spatial neglect include problems with navigation. So there's that pathfinding thing, construction, so putting together tasks, and dressing, because you can only imagine if you can't figure out the spatial orientation of your clothes, it's pretty hard to put them on. And if you can't figure out that your left arm is your left arm, it's pretty hard to dress too. So spatial neglect has a lot of problems associated with it. People with spatial neglect might have difficulty finding their way, even within a single room. So they could get lost in a single room. I worked with one lady, and the facility that I worked in at the time had a really small gym. I mean, super small, like half the size of my current living room. I don't have a huge house, but it was really a very small gym. And she could get stuck in the corner of the gym super easily and not be able to find her way out without help. So that decreased comprehension of spatial relationships also causes two types of apraxia. And remember, apraxia is difficulty performing a motor task despite the physical ability to actually do it. So dressing apraxia is like difficulty dressing due to inability to correctly orient the clothing to the body. Like I was saying, if you can't just like spatially figure out where your clothes are and where they go, it's hard to get dressed. Construction apraxia is difficulty with drawing, building, and assembling objects. So that picture where the person had to draw the floor plan and draw the clock, that is construction apraxia. Neglect is a complex phenomenon with different presentations and diverse causes. So it's not just like one single area you can point out causes it. But it is really interesting to work with. When you're working with people with apraxia, which I've worked with lots of people with apraxia, after CVAs, you really have to get down to one step sequencing. So you say, do this, and then they do it, and then do this, give them the next step. So if you gave them 2 steps in a row, they would not be able to do it. But if you do one step at a time, then often they can do it. So you really have to, a lot of times with CVAs, with motor tasks and with cognitive tasks, you have to break things down to their simplest components. And I think maybe that's why I find it really interesting to work with people with CVAs, because that breaking down of tasks is a very interesting area of therapy. And if you can break down tasks at the level where people can do them and then relearn them and then put them back together, that's a huge accomplishment for people to be able to do that. So that's a fascinating area of therapy. The frequency of neglect, it's more severe and more persistent following right hemisphere damage for obvious reasons. That's the area where our body schema and our spatial schema are constructed. Neglect affects about 45% of people with severe traumatic brain injury as well. So it's not just CVAs, but severe traumatic brain injury. Persistent neglect is a predictor of increased requirements for assistance and more likely skilled nursing placement. So obviously, if you have neglect to the point where you have difficulty dressing, you're going to need someone to help you do that. And if you have difficulty with basic tasks, and basic ADLs. And so someone who has neglect is more likely to need to be in a skilled nursing facility or need to have um, constant monitoring from a caregiver. So it's a big deal. It's a really big deal. So just overall cerebral hemisphere function, the frontal lobes control motor function, initiation of activity, planning of nonverbal communication, goal-oriented behavior, judgment, interpretation of emotion, attention, flexibility and problem solving, social behavior, and motivation. Big, important area, right? Every area of the brain is important. The parietal lobes process somatosensation, they direct attention and provide perceptual schema that relate to the parts of the body relative to the environment and the world. Occipital lobes process vision, including spatial relationships of visual objects. They analyze motion and color and control visual fixation. So there's a vestibular lobe, a vestibular area in the occipital lobe that controls visual fixation via the vestibular ocular reflex, like we talked about. The temporal lobes process auditory information. They classify sounds and they process emotion and memory. Cerebral function is diverse and adaptable, and cerebral dysfunction can be devastating. So remember when we were talking about neuroplasticity and the recovery of function after a cerebral injury? The cerebral neurons cannot recover. They're not going to heal and recover, but because cerebral function is adaptable, areas of the cerebral cortex can adapt to take on new functions. So functional recovery from a stroke is possible because of that adaptability, which is really cool. But cerebral dysfunction can change your life incredibly. And being able to help people with rehabilitation from cerebral dysfunction is a really wonderful thing to be able to do.